Good evening. My name is Dr. Sebastian Mahfood, and I'm the Program Assistant for the Scriptorium Initiative, which is co-directed by Father Eugene Pintiuk, Dean of Holy Cross, and Dr. James Skedros, Professor of Byzantine Studies and Professor of Early Christianity. The Scriptorium Initiative advances Holy Cross's commitment to compelling preaching from the pulpit and to continuing education aimed at reaching traditional churchgoers as well as non-churchgoers who seek truth and meaning in a world of rapid and continuous change. You are joining us here tonight as part of that interactive and participatory engagement we're seeking. And with that, I present to you Father Philip Zymaris, Associate Professor of Liturgics and Interim Director of the Theology Program at Holy Cross. He attained his theology doctorate from Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. His main research interests are the evolution of liturgical piety and its impact on church architecture, iconography, and popular religion. He also concentrates his energies on the sacramental nature of the church and how this must ultimately be based on the life of the Holy Trinity. He is with us tonight to offer a talk on the Feast of Pascha. Father Philip, take it away.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sebastian, for your kind words and for all you do for the Scriptorium Initiative. We're going to start with a prayer appropriate for the Feast of Pascha that we're going to be talking about today. Christos anesti ek nekron thanato thanaton patis ascetis endis mnemasi zoin charisamenos. Christ is risen from the dead by death, trampling upon death, and to those in the tombs granting life. Truly, he's risen. We're going to be talking about Pascha, and this is an extremely important feast. It's the central feast of the Orthodox Church. It's the central feast of Christianity, of early Christianity, as is clear in Scripture and the theology of the United Church. Celebrating the resurrection of the Lord is what we believe this is, but we're going to try to submit to you that it's more than that. This is really a celebration of the resurrection of all, and therefore it is pertinent to us, and that's why it's important for us, and that's why it's world-changing. It's really something that is a game changer. It changes our whole cosmology. All creation is involved, and that's why this is so profound. This is the ultimate goal and meaning of Christianity. It is the purpose and goal of God, the purpose of creation, of the incarnation. This points to the full communion of his creation with him so it can live. This is a free, loving movement on God's part towards us. It's his free initiative, you might say, with the potential for us to reciprocate with our own free, loving movement towards him. And this changes everything. So this is really the fulfillment of all Scripture. This is the plan of God for our eternal life from the beginning. And it is the transformation, ultimately, of all creation, fulfilled in a very surprising and unexpected way. No one expected that the Scriptures would be fulfilled in this way. And as we've said in other podcasts, Scripture is veiled and needs to be opened by Christ. And his actions show the unexpected love of God, which changes everything for all of us. So this is truly the end and culmination of the plan of God for all creation and for all human beings who are made in the image of God. For the church, this feast is so important that it is above all feasts. And it is not even included in the list of the 12 major feasts of the Orthodox Church, because indeed the rest of these feasts actually spring forth from the celebration of Pascha. Pascha, in a sense, contains them all. And also, Pascha clearly preceded them chronologically. In other words, before the festal cycle of the church was fleshed out, Pascha already existed, as we're going to see. The rest of the feasts are really simply an elaboration or a commentary on the central mystery of Pascha. As St. Gregory the Theologian said, it is the feast of feasts and the celebration of celebrations. It excels all other celebrations as the sun excels the stars. And this is true not only of human and earthly feasts, but also of those belonging to Christ and celebrated for Christ. So we have to stress that this feast ultimately points to the restoration of the whole human being and of all creation at the end times, because this unfortunately is oftentimes forgotten, and this, let's say, distorts the meaning of the full, beautiful meaning of Pascha. So we're talking about a physical resurrection of all humanity, and we're going to see that all of creation is also included in this transformation. So it pertains to the whole human being, body and soul, because the human being is neither a soul by itself, as the Platonists and others would believe before Christ and even to this day, nor is the human being a body by itself, but the combination of the two, the combination of both of them, and something more. Otherwise, if the body is redundant to the human being, as the Platonists would say, a prison to be cast off, as they would say, then there would be no reason for the incarnation. Christ would have come as a soul or as an angel and basically coax us to die and become like him. No. Pascha has to do with the dogma of the church that the whole human being, body and soul, are in the image and likeness of God, are in the image of God, and that they are to be restored to life in the kingdom, the whole human being, that is to say. And we can't forget that the general resurrection is a dogma of the church and a clear teaching coming from Scripture. As we're going to see in the icons also, we are resurrected precisely in the same way that Christ was resurrected, according to the gospel descriptions. He did not come out of the grave as a ghost or a soul, but as a full human being. And this is so clear in Luke 24:39, when the resurrected Christ appeared to the disciples in the house where they were hiding, and he even went through the closed doors. So they thought he was a ghost. And he said, "Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." And then he ate fish. So this was totally physical, although also he was transformed because he was going through the walls. And also we have the episode in the Gospel of John with doubting Thomas, where Thomas was invited to actually touch his wounds. What's important here is the fact that Christ is he who he is. He is not someone else. He has his own body with the marks of his experience, even his wounds, the experiences of his previous life. These are not left behind. The cross is not left behind. All these things are transformed and turned into glory. The sorrow and death are turned inside out, as St. Maximus the Confessor would say. Also, it is clear that he is clearly physical, yet at the same time, he is somehow different because he's going through the walls. So there is a continuity, yet at the same time, a radical newness in the resurrectional body. He's physical. So in this sense, the physical and the created is not left behind. It's not transcended, abandoned, overcome. Rather, it is transformed, transfigured. It takes on the attributes of the divine life without losing the attributes of created life. It remains what it is, while at the same time participating in divine life. And because our bodies are one with the rest of creation, you are what you eat, as we say. All of creation, not only the human beings, will be raised and participate in the kingdom. As St. Ambrose from the 4th century says, if Christ did not rise for us, then he did not rise at all. In him the world rose. In him heaven arose. In him the earth arose. For there will be a new heaven and earth. This new heaven and earth, though, does not mean a different heaven and earth. There's this continuity. So remember Christ's body and the wounds on his body that denote, you might say, that continuity with the past. The past is not left behind. His identity, his previous identity, his body, and the marks on his body are not left behind. And this is why the church celebrates Pascha, to somehow celebrate this mystery of mysteries. So what I'm going to talk about now, and how I'm going to try to describe how the church describes, how the church tries to explain this mystery of mysteries. I'm first going to start with a few words about the liturgical history of the development of the feast. And then after that, we're going to look at some church art and iconography that tries to communicate this mystery. So, liturgical history, first of all. This central mystery is obviously so fundamental and crucial to the Christian message that there's no way that it wasn't celebrated from the earliest times in church history. However, it's strange to see that it seems that it was not celebrated universally all over the church originally, but it came from a specific community. We'll get to that. In the early church, before we have the full liturgical cycle with all the feasts that we have now, it took time for all these things to flesh out, because obviously you had to have more and more saints, more and more martyrs, and then gradually they were added to the calendar. But before this, the celebration of the Eucharist, the times when people would gather for the synaxis, were basically two main times: Sundays and Pascha. This Paschal celebration that I'm going to try to explain where it came from. First of all, Sundays. Sundays were considered to be in the early church a day of worship, the Lord's Day, as we already read in the Didache, an ancient church order from the 1st or the 2nd century. Also, it was seen as a celebration of the first day of the new creation. Also, the 8th day, which means a day that goes beyond the normal 7 days of the week, bringing us to the day of the unsetting sun, a new kind of situation, the unsetting sun of the kingdom. And then the celebration of Pascha. So regarding Sunday, obviously there would be a Eucharistic synaxis, a Eucharistic gathering every Sunday. And this was pretty much universal everywhere in the church. However, we also have a specific celebration of the resurrection of the Lord, the Pascha. And it seems that this originated originally in Asia Minor, where you have the spiritual grandchildren and children of John the Evangelist, where a Johannine school was developed. In other words, the Johannine school and the Gospel of John have a special stress on the Pascha, the Paschal mystery. And this has been brought out very nicely in Father John Baer's book, John the Theologian and His Paschal Gospel, a Prologue to Theology. And this is a great title because indeed the Gospel of John and this school, this Johannine school, has truly given us this profound theology that led us to the celebration of Pascha, led to the universal celebration of Pascha in the church. So we're talking about people like Polykratos, Irenaeus of Lyon, Polycarp, Ignatius of Antioch, Melito of Sardis, and others. According to the liturgical practice of this group, Pascha was celebrated as a one-night vigil, going from 14 Nisan, from the evening of 14 Nisan, into the night and early morning of 15 Nisan. 14 Nisan is the Passover, the Jewish Passover, and this is when Christ was actually in the tomb, according to, the Johannine description, the description in the Gospel of John, whereas the synoptics have a slightly different description. In any case, the church ended up adopting, regarding the timeline of the passion, crucifixion, and burial and resurrection, the church ended up adopting the chronology of John, as is very clear in Holy Week that we recently celebrated. So, yes, 14 Nisan, Passover, according to John, that was also the Sabbath, and he was in the grave. And 15 Nisan was the day of the resurrection. And Nisan is the first spring month of the Jewish calendar, and that's a lunar calendar, and therefore this is a month dependent on the moon and the spring equinox. And therefore it will not be the same every year, so it fluctuates. It's not a set calendar date, as it were. So the resurrection is attached to the Jewish Passover, according to the Johannine school, according to their celebration. Pascha is attached to the Jewish Passover and not specifically to Sunday, because this can end up being celebrated on any day of the week. What's important here is the theological connotation that this was a one-night celebration of the passion, death, burial, and resurrection of Christ as one mystery. Therefore, we have Christ as the crucified and resurrected one at the same time. That's important, because we need to hold this mystery together, because he's one person, as we'll see. We learn about this group, the Johannine group, later from the so-called Quartodeciman controversy. In the 4th century, it was considered to be a controversy, that the fact that these people were celebrating Pascha in a different way. But we'll get there. First of all, we have to ask, how did Pascha pass to the rest of the church, spread to the rest of the church? So these Johannine celebrations, the so-called these quartodecimans, it was a derogatory term, by the way, which means the 14ers, right? Because they celebrated on 14 Nisan. They initiated, they basically, the celebration of Pascha clearly originated in this milieu. And by the time you get to the 4th century, the fact that Pascha came from them was forgotten, and they were seen as those who still celebrated Pascha in the old way, 14 Nisan, were seen as, in a sense, heretics, or this way of celebrating was seen as an aberration, because by the 4th century, a new way of celebrating Pascha had basically been definitized, as we're going to see in a second. So, but let's just go back and again stress, the original celebration in this Johannine school was a one-night celebration, a one-night vigil, right, of the one mystery. And this is important. Why? Because Christ is one person, It's not like what we oftentimes think today, in a very Nestorian way, that the human part died and the divine part got out of the grave because he happened to be God. In other words, that's separating Christ into two different entities, two persons, which means if that's the case, we have no benefit from this. Because sure, he resurrected because he's God, but I'm not God. In other words, it's not connected with me because the human part is not affected in that sense, right? If they're separated. So the church made sure to keep this mystery together and to emphasize that Christ is one person and that the human and the divine natures are united in this one person indivisibly and unconfusedly. That's the Fourth Ecumenical Council. It says that. So otherwise, Pascha would be useless to us, and the resurrection of Christ would be his thing, a divine thing, and not pass over, not be transferred, not spread to the human. So the human being, as created, of course, and therefore coming out of non-being, cannot live forever by definition, because something that's created is circumscribed. And by the way, the notion that any part of the created world is automatically eternal, like maybe the soul, according to the Platonic way of looking at this, is not the Christian or biblical teaching. So I need to, emphasize that from the very outset. So human beings, as created beings, cannot live forever by definition. And on the other hand, gods cannot die. And therefore, we have the characteristics of these two things, the divine and the human, are put together in the one person of Christ, indivisibly yet unconfusedly. And what that means is that the attributes of each nature are shared and become one. We human beings, by grace, take on the attributes of God, like immortality, through this one person of Christ, who is totally the same and identified with us, exactly like us, regarding his human nature. And therefore, our nature is raised with his, whether we like it or not. And of course, this is the dogma of the general resurrection at the end times. Whether we like it or not, we're all going to be raised. And therefore, this is a done deal, you might say, for our nature. So our nature is already raised, but our free will never be violated by God, because he always respects our free will, because that's why we are in the image of God. We are not, an object. We are not, there's no forced salvation, as it were. So our free will is never violated by God, and therefore our task in this life is to train our will to catch up to our already risen nature, you might say, in order to freely embrace this gift given to us in the incarnation and in the Paschal mystery. So this is why there is so much ascesis, spiritual exercise in the church, in the Orthodox Church especially. This means that there's a cross that is involved. As we follow the way of life, he shows us, which is crucified love, laying our life for the other, as being the way God shows us who God is and who the true human being is. So this is the only way to life in abundance. So what's important to note is that this celebration on 14 Nisan, according to the Johannine school, was a strict fast. So there was a strict fast broken by this celebration in the evening of the Divine Liturgy, of the Paschal Mystery. So, and this was a celebration of the whole mystery, as we said, of the Passion, crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection. And then the question is, how did this practice spread to the rest of the church? Well, because of immigration and especially the immigration of these Asia Minor people that Joe and I in school, that basically were mainly in Asia Minor, this practice of theirs spread to other parts of the empire, especially Rome. But in order to comply with what was going on in the rest of the empire, many of these Quartodecimans ended up celebrating their Pascha on a Sunday as a sort of compromise, the Sunday after 14 Nisan. So this one-night vigil ended up becoming from, a fluctuating celebration that could have been on any day of the week to the Saturday evening after 14 Nisan. So we're saying Saturday evening going into Sunday, right? He was in the tomb on Saturday and he was resurrected on Sunday. So this caused the one night celebration of this mystery to become what? A 3-day celebration. How so? Automatically. In Asia Minor, it was a one-night celebration, but it ended up expanding. How so? Because this was a strict fast. And this strict fast was transferred to a Saturday, and we know that according to the church canons, Saturday was never a strict fast. So this being the only exception shows that this was coming from a different context and planted as a package into a new situation, and therefore you have the exception to the rule, right? So it became from a one-day fast, broken with this vigil liturgy, you have a 2-day fast and a Sunday Pascha. You have that Triduum. In other words, the Triimeron, the 3-day celebration of Holy Friday, Holy Saturday, and Pascha. How so? Because Friday is also a fast day, a strict fast day, and you add to this strict fast this exception of a strict fast on this Saturday, and then you have a Sunday as the celebration of the resurrection. So you have a Holy Friday, Holy Saturday, and Pascha Sunday. And this is coming from recent research seen in the excellent book by Paul Bradshaw and Maxwell Johnson, The Origin of Feasts, Fasts, and Seasons in Early Christianity. Now, with the legalization of Christianity, this Triduum, this 3-day celebration, could expand to become Holy Week. In other words, as more and more of the events leading up to these 3 days, could be fleshed out with the legalization of Christianity, and especially because of the fact of, the Church of Jerusalem, where the things that actually led to the Passion actually happened there, and you have actually the geographical places, the actual scenes, locations where these things happened. It was easy to begin to flesh out the details by having celebrations on different days in the places where these things happened, right? Where these events happened. So you have Holy Week spreading, from the 3-day celebration to a whole week, and then you have Saturday of Lazarus and Palm Sunday and so on and so forth, and then it expands more and more and more. And then you have this celebration, and then every Sunday, by the way, in our church now, has sort of like become a small Pascha. So the original meaning of Sunday, the first day or the 8th day, the Lord's Day, the day of new creation, is combined with Sunday as being the day of the resurrection throughout the year, okay, because of this Paschal connotation that was synthesized. So, having said all this, I think we can now look at a PowerPoint that I've prepared for you to see how this way of looking at Pascha was basically preserved in early church art for a longer time, because church art is usually more conservative. It sort of like takes a long time for it to change its style, because from artist to artist, you have certain rules as to how to do these things. So you see, in a sense, these pristine kind of like theological principles being preserved for a long time in art, as I'll try to show you. So let me share screen. Okay. So first thing we see here is the this beautiful depiction, one of the earliest depictions of the crucifixion. And why am I giving you a depiction of the crucifixion? Well, because clearly, as I said before, this depicts the one mystery. In other words, you have the crucified and risen one. He's not a dead Christ on a cross, but he is at the same time crucified and risen. In other words, he's on the cross, yet he is alive. He's the victorious ones. So what you see here is that mystery is being held together. So later on, obviously, we do have the different celebrations of different days, and Holy Friday being the crucifixion, Saturday being the day he's in the tomb, and that's all good as long as this whole mystery is held together. In other words, Father John Baer made a great analogy that it's kind of like the one mystery is the white light, and this white light goes through a prism and becomes different colors. And so you can look at this specific color, and that's, the crucifixion. This is, Christ being in the grave. That's great as long as we know that the source is the white light. It still holds together as the white light. So it's one mystery. Trampling upon death by death. To this day, our Apolitikion, our troparion for the feast, actually holds together this mystery. And our hymnology to this day clearly does this too. In any case, we see that this mystery is held together. This beautiful crucifixion on the door, 5th century door of Santa Sabina in Rome, has the living one, the victorious one, yet he's on the cross, and he almost is embracing us. He's in a position of prayer, an oran's position, okay? And so this is what you find in the early crucifixes. Like this one also, from the Mascal casket from the 5th century, probably from northern Italy or maybe Rome. In any case, you see Christ is the living one on the cross. So crucified and resurrected at the same time. You're not separating, the let's say the dead human from the living God. It's all one thing, okay? So you have that. And also in the Rabula gospel, 6th century from Syria, we have the same thing. He is the living one. And not only that, he is not naked, but he's wearing a royal robe, a colobium. And oftentimes he is dressed in royal purple, which denotes, royalty. The fact that he is the king, the true king. He is the fulfillment of all kingships. He is the king of glory, even though the Gospels talk about the emblem above his head being the king of the Jews. In iconography, it's changed to the king of glory because this is in fact what the cross, which, at one level was seen as obviously a humiliation and terrible punishment and so on and so forth. God turned it around. He turned it inside out and made it into glory. So we have that. So the Rabula Gospels and also Santa Maria Antiqua, the same form. You see the purple colobium, right? And that was made out of, the purple was made out of these rare snails, murex snails. Okay, very expensive to make that purple, and therefore purple was only, this kind of fabric, purple dye, was limited only to royalty in the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. So this is from the 8th century, so we see it holds on for a long time. He is the King of Glory, and he is truly in full control, right? And this is what the Johannine school, this is the Gospel of John very much emphasizes, that, whereas in the Synoptics it says, take this cup away from me. In John, he basically says, what? Am I not going to accept this cup? In other words, he's in total control. He is voluntarily going to his crucifixion because this is his voluntary, loving, free, loving movement towards us. He's laying his life for the other. He's laying his life for us. And then we have also the Sinai crucifixion, the same style. Again, with the colobium, the purple, as it were. And this is from the 8th century. And finally, you find that after iconoclasm, this type changes. You have a new type Although the old type, the alive Christ, the victorious one, looking at you with his eyes open and so on and so forth, does survive till around the 11th century. You see from the 9th century on a new type, and this is the type that eventually, let's say, predominated and became the standard. And that is the typical Byzantine style that we are familiar with. That is the sleeping Christ. Okay, but in other words, he is, and this was to prevent the danger of a docetist, interpretation. In other words, that he was not really a human being. That he was, since he was alive on the cross, and it seems as if he didn't die, according to that older form, which had its theological message to give. The danger was to misinterpret this in a Docetist fashion, meaning Docetist meaning that, Docetism, kata to dokun. In other words, that it just seemed as if he was in the flesh. It just seemed as if he's died, but he didn't really die. He was really a ghost, or he was something else. He was not really a human being in that sense. So to emphasize the fact that he truly was a human being, and that he truly died, you have this form coming up. But it's not a hopeless form. It's also, in a sense, the resurrection is still there. It's still holding the whole mystery together, right? Because it has the light of the resurrection. It's not a gruesome, it's not one-sided. It's not showing, let's say, the human part dying. The divine is there too at the same time, right? You have the light of the resurrection. It's as if he's sleeping, but it's colored by the victory and light of the kingdom. Therefore, what you have here in these kinds of icons is not a snapshot of a moment in history, of a slice of time, as it were, but the whole story. It is an eschatological. The eschatological victory is always there. It's always evident. In other words, there's history and mystery. It's all there. The whole story. It's not just one specific time. It's a theological statement rather than a picture of a moment in time. And that's why you don't see there's this icon, which is a beautiful icon from Daphne near Athens. Moni Daphniou is full of light, and it's a beautiful depiction. And also to emphasize the eschatological meaning of the cross, that it's not something that happened in the past, but this is the glory, and this is ultimately the eschatological glory, and that the cross is not left behind. It's simply it's transformed, transfigured, but it's turned inside out, but still doesn't disappear, turned inside out and is made glory. You have this depiction, which is a beautiful depiction from the 6th century church of Sant Apollinare in Classe in Ravenna, Italy. This is a beautiful depiction, actually, of, believe it or not, this is a depiction of the Transfiguration. But Christ being transfigured in the middle is Christ as the cross. So the cross is ultimately the Transfiguration. And you have, Elijah and Moses there on either side, and also you have the 3 apostles that were with Christ on the Transfiguration mountain. But you don't have a mountain; you have a garden. So there's an eschatological depiction of the kingdom of God that is to come. So you have these red clouds, or these pinkish clouds, depicting, the second coming, the dawning of the sun that will never set. And Christ in the middle is basically depicted as a cross, because, as we read in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 24:30, Christ will come back with the sign of the Son of Man. And the fathers of the church see this sign of the Son of Man as being the cross. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Okay, on the clouds of heaven, right? So the dawning of the new day, and that's why you have these pink clouds. It's fantastic. And in many other churches in Rome, this is Ravenna, but in Rome you'll have many early mosaics that have these pink clouds as a depiction of the second coming. So the second coming is connected with the cross, and therefore this depiction of the cross has this kind of a connotation. But also something else we have here that's very important for us is the fact that you have Saint Apollinare on the bottom. He's almost bigger. He's a very prominent figure. And you have the 12 apostles in the form of a sheep, okay? And you have all of creation participating in this situation. You have the church at prayer. The church's job is to prepare us for the second coming, to make the kingdom, to be kingdom builders. In other words, up to that time, the church, by interceding, and is making the world into the kingdom. The church is interceding, integrating, cultivating, transforming the world into the kingdom, subduing the chaos around us and giving it form, making it into a garden, a paradise. And just like bees. So bees, it's fascinating that on his phelonion, you have those little dots. You can't really see them, but if you look at them from very up close, they actually are bees. Now, what does that mean? This is the job of the church. This is the job of the church, to basically make the kingdom. In other words, to when we say subdue in Genesis, it doesn't mean dominate over creation, but to be good stewards of and to make it into the kingdom, to bring it together. And like the bees, what the bees do is they take wild honey from various flowers, bring it all together, and make it into honey. And so what you have here is this whole idea of bringing about the promised land, flowing with milk and honey. What a beautiful analogy that is. And you have to really stress here that all of creation is participating in this situation that the church is bringing about, that God is bringing about, that we are waiting for. The animals, the plants, and you see that the hills are kind of like, and are inviting, and it's kind of like green. There's a nice verdure to everything and everything, which, interestingly enough, later on you find, especially in Byzantine iconography, kind of like, let's say, peters away in a sense. The style changes after the defeat of iconoclasm. There was, when the icons began to be reinstated, there was this fear of, another iconoclastic kind of like movement starting, the fear of if you have too many animals and plants and things and figures, being accused of idolatry. Okay, so that's why you find that later iconography and this actually is, Ravenna was the western capital of the Byzantine Empire, so this is very Byzantine. So this was pre-iconoclastic art. Byzantine art looked like this. So this was a center for pre-iconoclastic art, and it survived because the iconoclasts couldn't get to them in the West, whereas in the East you don't have much pre-iconoclastic art surviving. So we have this. So the earliest resurrectional. So again, the reason I'm showing you this is I want to stress this whole notion of the fact that the cross is an eschatological sign, not something that is left behind. It is transformed into glory, and you're going to see that this is something that's held together in all the good resurrection icons. In other words, the one mystery of the one Christ being the crucified and the resurrected one at the same time. So the earliest sort of resurrection icons are very symbolic, and you find this famous Jonah sarcophagus from the 3rd century. It's actually in a museum in Rome today. And you find another sign that Christ talks about in Matthew chapter 12, verses 38 to 42. An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it, except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So this becomes an early depiction of the resurrection, the basically holding the whole mystery together again, the death, burial, and resurrection as one mystery, using the type, you might say, of Jonah. And so here he is, being swallowed by the sea beast, as it were, and here he is being regurgitated from the sea beast. And also you have the depiction above, over here, of basically pointing to the tomb of Christ, that is the tomb that fashions the human being. And this is taken from the artistic language of the day. It's taken from the depiction of the known depiction of Endymion from Greek mythology. In any case, it's a story for another day, but it's a fascinating history. So you have this, and then gradually you have again. You have this typical Rabula gospel depiction of the one mystery, the living one, the victorious one, the crucified and risen one at the same time. And the sort of like earliest attempts to have a separate icon referring to the resurrection is the empty tomb, as you see on the bottom. Here's a close-up of it. The empty tomb with the myrrh-bearing women, right? Visiting the empty tomb, because this is according to the gospel description. And the empty tomb was seen as a sort of proof of the resurrection. Okay, so again, we don't have Christ being depicted coming out of the grave alone, because that would be his thing and not our thing in a more Nestorian way. The divine part got out, and it doesn't affect me as a human being. So you have this biblical depiction of what is actually described in the Gospels, rather than that which is not, because the Gospels do not describe Christ, how Christ came out of the cross alone, and it's not necessary for our faith, because we know that he did, and that's enough. But the thing is that this leads to our resurrection. It affects us, because it holds together. Okay, so we have that, and then this is common in other early art. You find this pilgrim's reliquary from the 6th century. Here's a close-up of that, again, of this empty tomb and the myrrh-bearing women. And sometimes you have just an empty tomb, right, without the myrrh-bearing women. But the depiction with the Myrrhophores, right, the depiction with the myrrh-bearing women visiting and seeing the empty tomb is common, and basically to this day it exists as a parallel, you might say, alternate, you might say, sort of icon of the resurrection. And probably the earliest depiction of this is from the 3rd century Dura Europos house church in eastern Syria, in today's eastern Syria. So this is from the 3rd century. Okay, and Sant Apollinare Nuovo, another Sant Apollinare, not the Sant Apollinare in Classe, which is the last one we saw, that huge, depiction on the apse of the Transfiguration as being the cross, that the cross and the glory, the Transfiguration and cross are connected, and connected with the ultimate eschatological renewal of everything. In any case, you have that. Okay. And then finally, we have this 8th century Anastasis icon in Santa Maria Antiqua in Rome. And this is one of the earliest depictions of this form that we recognize today as the Anastasis icon. And in East and West, this was the icon of the Anastasis. This was the image of the Anastasis. And it needs to be, we need to say from the very outset that this was always labeled as Anastasis, which means something very specific. It means resurrection. It was never, ever labeled as, I is avu katholos, the descent into Hades or hell. Never. Okay, so we'll talk about this more. It's very important for the theological message of this icon, even though this misnomer has become so common that we uncritically simply accept it wholesale. In any case, we find the same image also in this 9th century Schlütdorf manuscript with these illustrations, these miniature illustrations, right? Which is probably originally from Constantinople. And of course, we have this familiar image from, which is the known Byzantine form of the Anastasis. This is in Daphne from the 11th century, Daphne near Athens, 11th century. And you see that still the one mystery is held together. He's holding the cross. The cross is on his halo, right? He's stepping on death, as it were. And the gates of death are kind of like in the sign of a cross, too. And also his wounds are very prominent. In other words, the cross is not left behind, but it's transfigured. He becomes the crucified and risen one. And this is his glory, as it were, right? And by the way, just look at how he's holding Adam and Eve, or Adam in this case. Adam and Eve, of course, represent all of humanity. And we're going to say the fact that what's important in this icon is the fact that he's not alone. It's not his resurrection, it's our resurrection. It's really an eschatological icon of the general resurrection that will be at the end times. So we'll get there. But look how he's holding the wrist of Adam from behind the wrist. In other words, yeah, actually behind the wrist rather than on the wrist, which means this denotes weight, physical weight. He's not pulling up a soul. This is not, he's not descending, and he's not pulling up a ghost in order to tell the ghost that, you know what, it's not time for the resurrection yet, the second coming, so go back down now, or whatever. Okay, so, and by the way, resurrection means a physical resurrection. It doesn't mean a soul, floating up into heaven or something like that. In any case, and then we have also Ossus Lucas, another 11th century beautiful mosaic with the same sort of style, right? With the cross and all these things that we just mentioned. And again, he's holding Adam from behind the wrist in a very physical way. And then we have the famous 14th century Hora Anastasis, which has become sort of the template for all Anastasis icons. And he's clearly not alone. He's with Adam and Eve, represent all of humanity. And they're, in a sense, being taken up from the dust of their grave, which means this is a true creation of the human being. What you find in Genesis is simply a type, okay? Well, the real creation is at the end, when we are created from the dust of our tombs, right? Because the tomb becomes a womb in that sense, because none of us actually came from dust, right? We all came from our mother, as far back as you go in human history. So, but this is different. This is actually the human being being created out of the dust of our graves, and he's not alone, and he's with, on the one side, on his right, he has his ancestors in the flesh, right? King David, King Solomon, St. John the Baptist is there too, because he also was a relative, right? And on his left, on your right, you have Abel with the sort of shepherd's crook, right? Being a type of Christ, because he was the first person unjustly murdered, slaughtered, just like Christ. And then you have and Moses and others on the other side too. Okay, so you have that, and we must say that Anastasis is always universally the label on all of these icons. And Anastasis means something, and we need not ignore the connotation of this word. It comes from the verb anistimi, which means rise up, make someone stand, making someone be raised up, okay? So here, Anastasis can refers to both Christ's rising from the dead and his raising of all people from the dead at the end times. And therefore, he's not alone. It's not him coming out of the womb, the tomb alone. it refers to us. It's relevant to us. Okay, so it's connected with our human nature. It's not just the divine. It's pertinent to us, and it's clearly pulling them up. I mean, if you want to say that it's an icon that is not one historical moment, as we said before, that's what icons do. They tell you the whole story. That's fine, and then you could say that it is descending and ascending. That's fine, but it's a symbolic depiction of the whole mystery that will be fulfilled at the end time. So ultimately, it's an eschatological icon showing what will happen to us at the end, and that's why Christ is pulling Adam and Eve, representing all of us, out of the tomb. So it's clearly not a depiction of a moment or a snapshot of a specific time in the past, like this whole idea of the harrowing of hell, the descent into Hades, which was never the title, and this is a very recent development that has been uncritically sort of accepted and adopted and perpetuated, and it has a different connotation. Its connotation is that this is something in the past, and it's the moment that Christ went into the tombs. Well, it says anastasis. Anastasis means literally resurrection. So perhaps this prominence of this new name comes from maybe the dominance of a more Western paradigm. In other words, judging from the Western point of view, from the Western way of looking at art, using Renaissance art or Western art as the sort of template or the paradigm. Western art typically likes to paint a moment in real history, like a photograph, and therefore interpreting it this way and not realizing that Byzantine icons always have this eschatological aspect to them. They're always colored by the final victory of the kingdom. Remember the Daphne crucifixion, full of light. In one depiction, it's really the crucifixion and the resurrection. In other words, holding that mystery together. So from the Western point of view, however, art seems to want to look at one moment in history, and interpreting this icon from that point of view, it's easy to say that, it must be the moment when Christ went into the tomb, and so on and so forth. And we see that even Orthodox iconographers adopt this misnomer, which never existed, and we see it coming around the 18th century. We'll get there. But you see Orthodox iconographers adopting this misnomer and totally randomly saying that this is not even the anastasis of Christ, but the moment immediately preceding his solitary resurrection. Okay, going 2,000 years back, a slice of, a snapshot of a specific time, a specific moment. Okay, but what this does is this cancels out the profound theology of this icon, and specifically Anna Cartsonis, a professor at Princeton University, wrote in her masterful work Anastasis, the Making of an Image. She says specifically that regarding this wrong title that has unfortunately been universalized, she says any designation of the subject matter of this iconography as the descent or harrowing of hell misrepresents and distorts the message of the chosen label anastasis. The concept of rising and descending are obviously antonymous and therefore not interchangeable. Furthermore, the choice of the one over the other vitally affects the theological emphasis, and we're interested in theology here, vitally affects the theological emphasis and interpretation of the image labeled anastasis. So we find that in the 18th century painter's manual by a certain Dionysius ek Furnas, he had in this book of kind of like teaching iconographers how to paint icons, he had two versions of anastasis. he had the typical this typical Eastern anastasis, and he had a new sort of like type that was coming in from the West, the typical Western resurrection of Christ coming out of the tomb alone, as we're going to show you in a second. And because he had these two versions, he couldn't name both of them the same thing. So he ended up naming Christ being resurrected by himself, resurrection of Christ, and the anastasis he renamed Harrying of Hell. And so that's really where this is coming from. In order to avoid confusion, he renamed the traditional icon that which it was never named, ironically. And then you see in the West this kind of icon. So I'm talking about this kind of icon that ended up seeping into the East and into this, and even into this book of this iconography, this Eastern iconography book, teaching, let's say, iconographers how, the sort of style of iconography and how to paint and so on and so forth. Okay, and the sort of types or designs for each of the specific icons. So this icon had gotten into that Eastern book. And what am I talking about here? Well, this earlier sort of diffidence or hesitancy of the church to depict Christ coming out of the tomb alone, which is not, there's no biblical, gospel description of this. This sort of hesitancy eventually was forgotten, and by the second millennium, in other words, by 11th century, let's say, you have this icon becoming more and more popular and current in the West, and eventually seeping over into the East. And basically, what you have here is it's his victory. It really has nothing to do with us. And then, in a sense, Pascha in the West doesn't have such a profound meaning, an existential meaning. It doesn't affect us. And therefore, how in the West, Christmas is a big deal, but Pascha oftentimes, passes by unnoticed. And the main kind of like, things that, let's say, point to Pascha in the West are, chocolate bunny rabbits. Okay, but there's not this earthquake, this absolute, radical breaking down of death for all people. In other words, it's his thing, not our thing. So you have Christ pretty much coming out as a solitary, powerful, conquering hero. This is the victory of God and not of man. Okay, in a sense, he's getting revenge. He's getting back at his enemies, saying, "See, I'm victorious. I actually was God. I actually am God." And oftentimes he even has a banner of victory. It's his victory, not our victory. So this gives a totally different theological message. And there even is a book by, I think, Dominic Crossan, a Westerner, who basically traces this and sees that there is this duality. No other icon, in other words, has such a duality besides this depiction of the anastasis. In any case, so here we have God being depicted as strength in strength, the typical religious view of God as a Zeus type of God, right? Rather than the gospel image of God as strength in weakness, which is totally radical and totally turns everything into upside down. And that's why Christianity has value, because it turns everything upside down. It's not like all the other religions. It's the end of religion. It's the fulfillment of religion. The religious people actually crucified Christ and put him on the cross, and therefore religion died with Christ on the cross. And we have something totally new here, the turning around of religion and making it into something else, you might say. Okay, so this depiction is not a communal. It does not affect us. Rather, you might say it's a Nestorian separation of the victorious God part with the dead human part. Here's another depiction of the victorious God part, okay, basically floating. It's almost non-physical, almost ghostly. And then you have the human part, however, is dead flesh. And I'm not denigrating the art. The art is beautiful, and the tradition of Western art is beautiful. So we're not denigrating that. But we're saying that here that we're talking about a theological message. There is a different theological message that is communicated in this art. And that's really what we're talking about here, because we want to talk about the Eastern celebration of Pascha and what it means, how it holds this whole mystery of the crucified and risen one together. Whereas this actually, whereas the previous one, the ghostly kind of like resurrection of Christ alone, has the divine part, getting out of the grave, okay, not affecting us. The human part is dead. So it's like two people, right? Again, it's this Nestorian sort of separation, right? There is a Nestorian separation of the victorious God part and the dead human part as two different things, right? That don't really communicate, as it were, right? The attributes of both are not, shared. And then you have this famous depiction by Piera della Francesca from the 15th century. And he has the banner here. And this is a beautiful, and I'm not denigrating the art. This is beautiful, absolutely beautiful art. And it's very important. But I'm just saying that it does give us a different theological message, a very different message from this depiction in the monastery of Hora in Constantinople, 14th century depiction, which has become the sort of template for the go-to kind of like depiction of the resurrection. And it says anastasis. And you might say that, well, isn't there a tradition of Christ going into Hades and announcing good news of the things to come to the dead? Of course, that's in Scripture. But it says nothing about pulling them out. And therefore you have these, excerpts of these passages, right? From 1 Peter 3:18-19, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit, by whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison. Doesn't say anything else. And then 1 Peter 4:6, for this reason the gospel was preached also to those who are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. So everything changes because of this one mystery of the crucifixion and resurrection, right? The whole world changes. The whole cosmos changes. And in Ephesians 2:4-9-10, in saying he ascended, what does it mean that he also first descended into the lower parts of the earth, filling all things? Yes, but the depiction of the anastasis is not that. It says anastasis, and anastasis means something very specific. You also have other descriptions, and oftentimes people say that the descent into Hades and all that is coming from this, the Acts of Pilate, which is a 5th century apocryphal text. Part 2 of, actually the Acts of Pilate is part 2 of the apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus. And also there's the 7th century Holy Saturday homily of Pseudo Epiphanius of Cyprus. But these are imaginative, kind of like, speculative, descriptions of what it could be like, what it was like when Christ went down, according to 1 Peter. Okay, this is not an official teaching of the church, and even if it's okay to say that the church oftentimes accepts certain pieces of apocryphal literature, like the Proto-Evangelium of James. Many things about the Theotokos are accepted from there, right? Whereas the whole thing is not accepted as gospel, obviously. Still, either way, this icon is not depicting that. It's depicting what it says, exactly what it says, anastasis. And anastasis means physical resurrection. And clearly, this is a depiction of the pulling out of humanity from their graves at the end times. It's an eschatological depiction. And this is clear again in the wrist. The fact that these are not ghosts, but these are human beings, physical. There's a physicality to them, and that's why they are being held from behind the wrist. And you see this in close-up, and also we see in the same church, this Hora church, another icon, another depiction, is a depiction of the raising of the daughter of the leader of the synagogue, Jairus, where there are 3 instances where Christ resurrects people, right? the son of the widow at Nain, and this daughter of Jairus, right? And also the raising of Lazarus. But very nicely, in a very clearly, she's a real girl. She's physical. She's not a ghost, and she is being pulled in the same way by the hand, as you see there, right, from behind the wrist. So this denotes physicality. And by the way, these resurrections of this girl and the son of the widow and Lazarus were like resuscitations, right? Because they had to die. They eventually died again. Whereas what happened to Christ is something that's going to happen to us at the end times, which will be, taking on the divine attributes of immortality that will be forever, while at the same time not losing our createdness and our physicality, because those things were created by God and they are good. They are not to be abandoned or, overcome or transcended. Okay, they are transfigured and transformed. So you have that, and you see that this is coming from a long tradition where even in ancient Greece you have these bridal kind of like processions where the bride is brought into the procession by holding her hand. She's led in the procession, holding her hand from behind the wrist in the exact same way. So this is a long tradition, and it denotes, procession, and maybe also it has a connotation of marriage. Okay, it points to the marriage of Christ and his bride, the church, and that's us, which will be consummated at the end times. So Christ is bringing us, his bride, the church, into the eternal wedding of the kingdom. And this is really the general resurrection at the end times. And more evidence that this depiction of the anastasis, the way we have it in the East, with Christ pulling Adam and Eve out of the grave, and he's holding the cross. You see this very Byzantine depiction here, also in this Santa Maria Assunta church, which is very Byzantine again, because, as I said, Venice, I didn't say Venice, but I said Ravenna, Venice, this is near Venice, Torcello Island is near Venice. They all were very Byzantine. They were kind of like the Western outpost of the Byzantine Empire, so the art was truly Byzantine. And this is from the 12th century, and you see it's the same form. But the interesting thing here is, and this is the proof of the pudding, that this is really an eschatological depiction of the resurrection of all at the end times, is this is put in the context of the second coming. This west wall of this church is clearly a depiction of the second coming, and you see it in a better here on this black and white shot, right, where the central sort of icon is, the prominent icon is this icon of the resurrection, but this is in the context of the second coming, as you see, right? Right below him is the resurrection of all, or the judgment of all. So we have the resurrection of all, right, in the anastasis icon, followed by the judgment of all these people that have been resurrected. Okay, but also we have the cross up on top, and that's important. In other words, we will be raised at the end to be judged, but the cross is not left behind, because again, it maintains that the fact that this is two sides, the anastasis is basically it's two sides of the same coin, keeping this mystery of the crucified and risen one together. And we are incorporated into this Paschal mystery. And this is precisely what we do when we are baptized. We're baptized into his death and resurrection, right? As many of you as have been baptized in Christ have put on Christ. So we're baptized into this Paschal mystery of dying and rising at the same time. Those two things held together. The crucified and risen one. We become the same. We learn how to lay our life for the other. We learn that this is the way divine love looks like, right? And we find that this is the way to life. So this is the way to come out of our tombs. This is the way for our tomb to become a womb, as it were, right? And the font actually is a tomb and a womb, and our graves eventually will be a tomb and a womb. And throughout our life, if we live like this, laying our life for the other, picking up our cross, then that dying to ourself becomes the beginning of our life, right? Our eternal life. And so if you really want, a depiction of, and so it's very clear that this is the case. This is another shot where you can see things in a little bit more detail, that you have all these three things together, right? Crucifixion, resurrection, judgment. It's all one mystery on this wall, this western wall of Maria Assunta on Torcello Island near Venice. This is in Italy, obviously. And you see that this is on the western wall, and therefore this is what people would see as they were leaving. So it kind of like warned them, or in the sense that kind of like, how do you say, emphasized to them, this is the life we should be living if we want our death to become a birth, our tomb to become a womb. So this is really fantastic. And if you insist that you need, and by the way, the same thing, this is not, Maria Assunta is not the only one. This is also in this famous church of the monastery of Cora, where we have this kind of like, definitive, kind of like beautiful standard Anastasis icon that everyone knows about. And in this case, it's on the east wall above the apse where the resurrection icon, the Anastasis icon is. In the sort of triumphal arch, you have what? The second coming. You see it? It's all together. So it all holds together again. Here's a close-up of that. 14th century. Beautiful painted mural. It's not a mosaic, but it's a beautiful example of Byzantine art from the 14th century, late Byzantine art, Paleologian, and also this is in a side church, a funerary church for a very important figure. So, if you insist that you absolutely need to have a depiction of that moment when Christ was in the tomb, and maybe not maybe, but truly filling death with life, and in other words, everyone has been affected, but of course, everyone before Christ, during Christ, and after Christ are affected by this. Okay, so that good news that's preached to them is known to all who are dead, okay, of all time. Okay, so it's not a moment in history, but it's always. But if you want to, kind of like, how do you say, pinpoint a moment in history or an icon that depicts that, it will be this icon, which is a fairly recent icon, again, from the Paleologian era, from the late Byzantine era, and this is in Vlatavon, Moni Vlatavon, in Thessaloniki, and this is the first time this type appears. We have Christ in the grave, and at the same time, as God on his throne above. And so this is an elaboration on an illustration of the second troparion of the canon of Holy Saturday that we recently chanted on Holy Saturday, and also in the Panihis service, so-called Panihis service, right before the service of light for the resurrection in any case. Kimati thalasis, but the second sort of troparion or hymn after this basic irmos is the ano se enthrono ke kato en tafo, which means you are on your throne above and in the tomb below at the same time. And this is fantastic. So all of these things are fantastic, and I thank you for your attention, and would say to you, Christos Anesti. So, Dr. Sebastian, take it away.
Well, all right. Well, thank you so very much, Father Philip, for your excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Father, I do have a question for you about
that. Father Paul, it's great to hear your voice.
It's great to hear your voice, Father Philip, and thank you so much. I had a question for you about, the very famous transposition of services that we encounter, and the morning and the evening, and the evening and the morning. And I'm curious to hear, do you have any opinions about whether or not it would be worth seeking a blessing to do something different than what than what has been developed over the sort of natural evolution of the church in terms of these service times?
Of course, and this happened in a sort of ad hoc way. There's no official teaching or dogma that, this is the way we do it. If you look at the Triodion, the book from which all these services come from, everything is in its place. Orthros in the morning, Vespers in the evening. So what happened was, perhaps, there are different theories during the Turkish occupation. It's a fairly recent development from the 18th or 19th century. So what happened was, maybe during the Turkish occupation, the fact that the Orthros service is where all the meat is, and the Vesper service, the pre-sanctified, which normally would be done in the evening, was simply a repetition of the same hymnology. I think the Orthros service was more popular. Orthros already, or originally, in the tradition of the church, was something like a midnight service. In other words, it was done very early in the morning. And rather than, people waking up early in the morning, it's easier to bring it to the evening before, like even the Slavs do, the Russians, the so-called vigil, right? They do their Sunday Orthros, or Matin service, on Saturday evening, right? So there's this, but also probably it got pushed back because of the fact that Holy Thursday had too many services, and there was a vigil service in the evening, the Panichis service from the old cathedral service, which had the 12 Gospels that we read to this day on Thursday evening. Basically, it ended up being synthesized with the Orthros of the next morning, Orthros for Friday morning, the Passion Orthros, because there were just too many services. So it became one, which means that there was no Orthros anymore on Thursday morning, and the first services that you would do on Friday morning, there was no Orthros service on Friday morning anymore. The first services you would do would be the services of the hours. And therefore, the Orthros was relegated to Thursday evening. And this is the Orthros that we do now, which is basically a synthesis of this old Panichis service with the 12 Gospels and an Orthros service. So because Orthros was moved to the evening for convenience sake, all the other Orthroses were moved back. In other words, the Orthros that would have been done that Thursday morning basically ended up being relegated to Wednesday evening, and all of the Orthroses. And so, anyway, this was something that was not planned; it just happened. And the Triodion, as I said, the actual liturgical books still retain them. So there's nothing wrong with doing it the right way. And even at the Patriarchate in Constantinople, they actually do, on Holy Thursday, they do the Matins in the morning, the Matins for Holy Thursday, which we now do on Holy Wednesday evening, but is not in the Papadeus book. It's just totally, it's been totally replaced by the unction service on Wednesday evening, which is not really part of Holy Week. Okay, so what doesn't belong, in a sense, took over the essential. In other words, what really belonged to Holy Week. That's a story for another day. But the point I want to make is that at the Patriarchate, they do that Orthros for Holy Thursday on Holy Thursday morning, and then in the early afternoon they do the liturgy for Holy Thursday, which is a Vesperal liturgy, which means it's fitting as a Vespers to be in the evening, right? And yes, and yes. So I don't know if I answered your question, but basically, I don't think there's anything wrong with doing everything in its place. The only problem would be the fact that these services are so popular that people who work would not be able to enjoy. If we have the Orthros in the morning, they would not be able to attend all of them. Whereas in the evening, it still is possible for everyone to attend these services.
Right. I mean, I reread Father Alcibiades' book this year, at least part of it on Holy Week, and it definitely seems that this was done for the pastoral regard of the people. The only thing I'm curious about is the possibility of moving the Vesperal liturgy on Holy Saturday morning back to the evening of Holy Saturday. And what that might, if that might be something that could be possible, practically given the weight of of recent experience and whatnot. And what do you think that would look like, if you think that's even a possibility?
Well, that service was the original Paschal Vigil, this one celebration in Constantinople. That was the one celebration that was the one Paschal Vigil. Well, in other words, it was the midnight service that now it's been doubled by another midnight service with the Liturgy of St. Chrysostom, as you know, because it was moved up, this idea that you have to have a midnight service, but also because of the fact that, you needed more liturgies basically to fit more people to be baptized, as it were. It seems that was part of the pastoral reason. The fact that it's in the morning now, its original purpose has been forgotten, and that's why we have all these in popular parlance, we refer to the first resurrection and the second resurrection. That's, there's one resurrection. There can't be two resurrections. But what ended up happening was, as I said, it was doubled later on, basically because of the marriage of the two traditions, of the Constantinopolitan tradition and the tradition of Jerusalem, which is our Byzantine Rite, basically. It's clearly a baptismal service, and this was clearly the original vigil that was connected with baptism because of those many readings that we do. We only do 3 of them now in the Vespers part, right? But originally there were 15 of these Old Testament readings that were basically a time, I don't want to say a time killer, but they were, during that time, the people were in the congregation waiting for the bishop to finish baptizing the people, the catechumens, in the baptistry that was a detached building, a separate building. And then those newly baptized people would come in with their paschal candles, right? Their baptismal candles, basically, and join the rest of the congregation for the celebration of the liturgy in order to participate as full members in the Eucharist and so on and so forth. So all this is lost, and it's very clear that, the strict fast, this only strict fast on a Saturday, was broken by this celebration in the evening, by this liturgy, which was a bigger feast than any feast, and the fact that we do this in the morning now, and then we go out and fast, I mean, we have to because it's a strict fast day. It loses its meaning because there's this brightness and this kind of like this big earthquake and this victory, the sign of victory, of throwing laurel leaves all over the place, right? This earthquake, as it were, of trampling upon death by death, which was clearly the original celebration of Pascha, of the resurrection. This is moved to the morning, and people try to reinterpret as, what does this mean? It's probably the first resurrection, and then there's going to be another one tonight. So I really think that this service is important, and as the original resurrectional service, and it's really clearly very bright and very resurrectional. And it's a shame to kind of like for it to lose its meaning, as it were. And a lot of people don't even know that the service exists. People always go to the midnight service, which is this later development and this doubling of this original service. But many people don't know about the morning service, which is not a morning service, it's an evening service. It's the Paschal Vigil. They don't know about it, and they don't experience the beautiful theology in the hymnology. And the theology there is basically seeing this whole thing as one mystery. Yes, it talks about going down into Hades, and this whole concept of going to Hades and filling Hades with his life is a tradition, and you find it in 1 Peter, preaching to those dead and so on and so forth, right? You also find some inklings of this in the apocryphal literature of the Gospel of Nicodemus, and also there are other scriptural references to this, but this is not what that icon called anastasis is referring to. It's referring to something else. It's referring to the eschatological event of the general resurrection of all humankind, and that's why he's not alone, and it's not him as an individual or as a hero coming out of his grave, but it is the communal resurrection of all people. So, in a long-winded way, I answered your question, or maybe I didn't answer it.
Thank you so much, Father Philip. I appreciate it, and thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you for your attention.
Well, then that wraps up tonight's presentation. Father Philip, would you lead us in a closing prayer?
I will, and I'm going to use another hymn from the Paschal service, and that is the Kondakion, which also is a very much holds together this one mystery. So, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, even though you descended into the grave, O immortal one, you destroyed the power of Hades, and you arose as a victor, O Christ our God, saying to the myrrh-bearing women, Hail! And to your apostles, granting peace, you also grant resurrection to the fallen. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, both now and ever, and unto the ages of ages.
Thanks so very much, Father Philip.
God bless.
And thank you, Father Paul.
Christ is risen.